then I started getting calls from attorneys wanting me to be an expert witness around cases related to claims of sex addiction. The link for me is that I'm going in and helping fact finders, judges and juries, understand these concepts, these issues, based upon the best scientific evidence we have right now, as opposed to the general myths that the public generally holds.
What happens when attitudes around sexuality enter the courtroom? What if the biggest decisions about sex in our legal system are being made based on myths, not science? That's the basis for our fascinating conversation with forensic psychologist Dr. David Ley. We talk about what happens inside courtrooms, how kink and non-traditional relationships get misinterpreted, and why people's lives can be completely changed by misinformation about sex. Dr. Ley is a world-renowned clinical psychologist, author, and expert in forensic sexuality, known for bringing scientifically grounded, clinically sound perspectives to conversations about sexuality and mental health. He serves as an expert witness in complex legal cases, helping courts understand sexuality through evidence instead of stigma. If you're ready to understand how sex gets judged in court, why that matters, and how that impacts your work, then this one might shift your perspective. Let's dive in. Welcome to Sexology Lab. Each week, we speak with the most compelling minds in modern sexology to ask the questions shaping the future of desire, connection, and human wellness. Let's dive in. So, David, what is one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
That I'm actually more of an introvert. People are always surprised that my idea of a good time is sitting and reading a book, maybe at a bar, but reading a book and having a beer. I will talk and engage with people, but I recharge through kind of quiet time. And even though I can do the extroverted act and do it pretty well, I think, it is energy. It takes a lot of work for me. And people that get to know me are kind of surprised that I oftentimes in private am pretty quiet.
That is surprising. You do the extrovert thing very well. But I'm also the same. But I do really love my quiet time.
An old professor mentor of mine explained it. The true extrovert is energized by that extroversion kind of attention activity. The introvert that is doing it and maybe doing it very well, it takes energy. It can be exhausting.
So I want to get to know you a little bit more. So let's start out by sharing your 30-second origin story. How did you first find your way into sexual health and specifically into the forensic sexuality space?
Well, with the last name Lay, I didn't have a whole lot of options, right? I was originally trained in forensic psychology. I was working in Texas as a forensic psychology with a probation system. And these police officers brought me a big manila envelope all wrapped up with evidence tape. And they said, Dr. Lay, we need you to go through this and tell us if there is any deviant material in here. And what had happened was that a teenage kid was ditching school, breaking into his neighbor's house, using their computer and color printer to print out full-page porn pictures off the internet. And now this was 25, 30 years ago.
Right.
And they wanted me to go through this and see if there was any deviant material. Well, how do you define that, right? And I wanted to do a good job. I'm a dedicated, committed professional. So, I locked the door on my office. I turned down the lights. And I spent 2 or 3 days going through that material over and over. I'm just kidding, right? But I had to testify in court as to whether, there was deviant material. And as I recall, it was all fairly standard, mainstream, almost Playboy kind of specific, nudes. I think the most deviant or edgy sort of thing was a nude woman in public kind of squatting over a orange traffic cone, like she was having the traffic cone penetrate her.
Yeah.
But that was the most edgy kind of thing in there. Honestly, it was my first experience testifying in court around sexuality issues and realizing just how subjective and ill-defined a lot of sexuality issues are, particularly when they get into court. And also realizing that courts because they are so ignorant and people generally hold so many misbeliefs and myths around sexuality, that folks that have expertise in these areas really have a lot to offer to the court around sexuality. That has become now a really significant part of my career. It's a lot of what I do on the side, testifying in court around sexuality related issues to help the judge, attorneys, and juries make decisions based on the best evidence that I can give them, as opposed to their subjective bias, whether they would do it or not.
So that was like your first experience with this whole world. And then after that, did you realize, like, hey, this is an interest of mine? Or was it more of like, this is something that needs to be done? Or a little bit of both?
I put forensic stuff really on hold in my career. I started doing a lot of other things. I ended up writing books about sexuality. My second book was called The Myth of Sex Addiction. And I really took on the validity of the concept of sex addiction. And then I started getting calls from attorneys wanting me to be an expert witness around cases related to claims of sex addiction. So, for instance, in Ohio, there were a couple of attorneys that had gotten in trouble for sexuality. One of them was kind of famously known as the naked photographer. He would jump out on a sidewalk and he would expose himself, opening a trench coat and expose himself to female passersby, and then he would take photos of their faces, surprised at his nude body. And when he got caught, it turned out he was an attorney. So he lost his law license as a result of this activity and conviction. A few years later, he was trying to get his law license back, and he claimed that this behavior had been the result of sex addiction. And the Ohio Supreme Court brought me in to testify about whether sex addiction was a valid kind of concept or diagnosis or not, and whether it was a legitimate excuse for his behavior. And of course, I argued that it was not. The court ruled in my favor, although a couple of years later, after he continued to behave and follow through on treatment and stuff like that, he did get his license back. But again, cases like that started popping up, and I ended up being kind of good at it. What works in these situations is being able to communicate about these complicated, nuanced issues in an accessible way that the jury can understand. As a result of that, my name started kind of getting around amongst attorneys. I started getting asked to testify about more issues. There are some expert witnesses out there that will testify for anybody about anything. And as a result, they're not viewed as having a whole lot of integrity or credibility. I try to preserve that. And so I limit my testimony generally to two broad areas. One is around sexuality issues, which obviously is a fairly broad area, but because there's so much ignorance and lack of understanding around sexuality, I can talk about kink, I can talk about sexual consent, I can talk about non-monogamy, I can talk about issues related to sexual assault. And then secondly, I testify about memory. And the link for me is that memory and sexuality are two areas where the general public holds a lot of myths, a lot of misunderstanding. People think that memory is like a video camera, that we have a hard drive in our brain that stores memory in a pristine, crystalline, unchanging nature. And the reality is completely against that. And so the link for me is that I'm going in and helping juries and fact finders, judges and juries, understand these concepts, these issues, based upon the best scientific evidence we have right now, as opposed to the general myths that the public generally holds.
And that's so interesting that you mentioned memory. I remember being in a psychology class, and on the first day, the professor walked in before the class, took some papers off the desk and left, then came back in and said, can you all describe to me the person who was in here? Like, what were they wearing? How tall were they? And it was really hard. And it just kind of gave a brief, simple example of, memory and recalling, being a witness to something.
And if he had asked the question, can you guys describe to me that person that aggressively came in and got those papers? It would change everybody's memory because our memory is so malleable to these kinds of things. There's famous research around that I'm borrowing from there. If you ask people to describe a car accident, and if you use words like crashing, then all of a sudden people's memory increases the speed and increases the violence of the experience, etc. So memory shifts, even memories of things like 9/11 that we would think are just such a big memory that that would never change. Research shows actually it does, that our memories incorporate new information and do shift over time from what we reported at the very beginning versus how our memory looks years later.
Oh, that's so
And
interesting.
and that stuff comes in to court because oftentimes in a lot of the cases I'm testifying in, the victim's memories are sometimes the only evidence. So then the question becomes, how much can the court rely upon those memories as evidence? And I have to be really careful. My job in testifying is not to diminish credibility of witnesses. I don't have an opinion of whether an incident occurred or not, but I want the jury to make decisions understanding that even victims' memories of sexual assaults can shift over time and may contain inaccurate information. I saw one case where a woman I worked with who had been sexually abused multiple times, and we were working through one of her memories of a sexual assault experience, and she stopped and she said, "No, wait a minute, that couldn't have happened because that table in the kitchen, that was in a different house." And so she had blended and blurred these experiences and elements of it. And that wasn't a situation that was in court. But I tell that story to help people, again, recognize that even traumatic memories, even memories that we feel like we're really strong, that our belief in the accuracy of a memory is actually not evidence that it is a accurate or valid memory. In fact, more times the strength of our belief indicates other stuff. I will get upset, damn it, I know I left my keys on the table. Somebody must have moved my keys. Who moved my keys? And then I find my keys in the fridge because the night before I was like, oh yeah, I need to put my keys in the fridge to remember to take my lunch tomorrow. But I was remembering all the other times I left my keys on the table and I didn't distinguish. And in that moment, I'm sure I left my keys on the table, but I was wrong. So that sureness is oftentimes, I think, an indicator that we need to be more skeptical of our memories and our beliefs.
Yeah, it's a humbling experience. I've done
It
that
is.
before, and I've blamed other people in my house for moving things. Then I realized, oh, wait, nope, that was actually me.
Yeah. I've ended up being involved in some really remarkable kinds of cases, particularly when we look at issues around sexuality. And my role as expert witness, and first to clarify some terms, forensic psychology, forensic sexuality can include a lot of things. It can include coming in and evaluating somebody and offering statements around their sexual health, around their mental health, around their diagnoses, around their competence. But it can also involve coming in and testifying as an expert witness. Sometimes I'm a blind witness where I don't know the facts of the case. Sometimes I am coming in and I am testifying about facts of the case and trying to help the fact finders. Again, that's kind of a term of art in court, that my job is not to find the facts. My job is to maybe explain the facts and in a way that the jury and the judge can understand. You may have heard of OneTaste. OneTaste was a group that does orgasmic meditation and teaches women and partners to stroke the woman's clitoris with oil and wearing a glove in a certain prescribed manner with the intent of using it as a meditative practice. OneTaste got kind of franchised. It generated lots of money. There was a Netflix documentary made about it that argued that there was a lot of exploitation, financial exploitation and such within this group, particularly by the leaders. And the FBI and Department of Justice ended up filing charges against the founders of OneTaste in New York, alleging that they had engaged in conspiracy to engage in workplace exploitation. And the charges were all based on these sexuality issues. And it included these allegations that the women were engaging in sex magic, that they literally, the indictment accused them almost of being sex witches. It really demonized female sexuality. There was non-monogamy that was happening within the community. It really condemned these women, these leaders, for encouraging women to have sex with men, for instance, that they may not be attracted to in order to overcome some internal kind of sexual barriers, etc. And I was hired by the defense to testify to normalize this sexual practice because they were concerned, I think appropriately, that the jury would view these women through kind of a slut lens and that there would be slut shaming going on. Now, what's interesting is that I ended up not testifying. The judge excluded both me and the prosecution witness arguing that our information just wasn't useful to the judge, useful to the court. And what's unfortunate is that they did end up convicting these two women that ran OneTaste of these pretty bizarre charges: conspiracy to engage in exploitation of workers. Conspiracy is just we were planning to do it. They weren't actually charged with actually exploiting anybody, but they were convicted. They are in prison now. They're appealing. And the trial really was filled with this perception of this sexual practice as being aberrant and abnormal, largely because it was focused on female sexuality, because it was focused on sex outside relationship, because these women were stepping into a more powerful kind of female role of sexuality. I was planning to testify about relating their practices to sensate focus. Sensate focus is a practice in sex therapy where we teach people to engage in non-goal oriented sexual contact, which is very similar to this OneTaste practice where they were stroking the clitoris without the intent to achieve orgasm, but to use that practice to achieve mindfulness. There were a number of things like that that I was going to testify about, and unfortunately didn't. But it was a good example. The wild thing is that that trial was going on almost parallel to the Diddy trial, P. Diddy, as Diddy was largely found not guilty of most of the charges against him as these women were condemned and prosecuted. And that is one of the things that I'm seeing right now is that there is a tremendous amount of social bias around sexuality and gender that is coming out in trials around sexuality. People that violate monogamy, people that are engaging in kink behaviors are really getting condemned and persecuted. As a result, I'm getting involved in more and more of these cases because there is kind of a war on sex right now. Marty Klein has a lovely book called America's War on Sex, and he could write a new edition of it right now.
So I'm wondering, is there a particular case or an experience that you've had that stands out that made you realize how important this work is, how important forensic expertise in sexuality really is?
Yeah. So one of the things that is happening right now, you may have heard me talk about this before. I can talk about it more publicly now because I'm not involved in any cases with it right now. But there are these stings that happen around the country where, for many years, since really the inception of the internet, there have been people that are online and engage in predatory behaviors in online spaces towards children. So as a result, since the days of AOL, there have been law enforcement officers that go into online spaces and pretend to be children. And then if a online predator attempts to solicit sexual behavior or activity with them, the officers will then arrange to arrest that person. And that probably is a good thing. There definitely are online people that engage in unsafe, predatory, dangerous behaviors towards children, and that's wrong, and that's a crime. What's happening now, though, is that there has been a bit of a shift, and we're seeing these officers, and sometimes they're local officers, sometimes they're state officers, FBI gets involved. I have seen, oftentimes these are multidisciplinary sting activities involving multiple law enforcement agencies, but I'm now seeing them go into adult-only, sex-specific online spaces. So FetLife, for instance, Grindr, Tinder, where they are going in and now they're not pretending to be children. Sometimes they are pretending to be an adult that allegedly has a child that is available to be sexually abused, or they are pretending to be somebody who is into age play. And then at some point they arrest that person that they were interacting with the argument that that person should have known that they weren't just a person engaging in age play. They were a child pretending to be an adult, pretending to be into age play, which gets kind of complicated, right?
Right.
So I saw this one case where it was really a tragic kind of case. A woman, she was on FetLife, she was kinky, she was really kind of a hardcore submissive. She liked consensual non-consent. She liked rough sex. She liked daddy-daughter kind of play, daddy-dom, little girl, DDLG kind of play. And she had been interacting with a guy who was into those things, according to his profile. He was into rough sex. He was into dominating females. He was into DDLG play. And she was flirting with him and they were maybe talking about arranging a hookup. She loses her phone. She's in the hospital visiting her dad, who's there. She uses her dad's phone to try and help her get a ride home. Because of two-factor authorization, she can't get into Facebook or her contacts or anything else. She can get into FetLife. So she gets onto FetLife and she connects with this guy, says, hey, could you give me a ride home? And he says, well, sure, if you come over to my house and we have sex, and I've got a cub that you can play with. So they had been talking about his cub for a little while. She thought that his cub was like her, an adult partner that was into age play.
I was just about to ask you, what does he mean by cub? Like, I'm
Yeah.
thinking like a real life kind of like animal situation here.
Right.
I didn't know what that meant.
In age play, cub is oftentimes a term that is used by a person describing their age play persona. In gay culture, gay pup culture, cub is describing a gay adult male who likes to take a puppy persona. He asks her, what role do you want to take? And she's like, well, I'd like you to fist me. The officer later reinterprets that actually and says, well, she wanted to fist my cub, which was not what she said. And I saw the transcripts. But she gets an Uber ride to this guy's house and gets arrested because it was a sting, and they locked her up with the argument that she should have known that when he was describing this cub, that he was actually describing a child that he wanted to molest with her. I testified in several hearings that the language that they were using was all language that is consistent in age play language.
Yeah.
There was no clear place where somebody that was in that age play world would have known or been able to distinguish, oh wait, no, this is not age play, this is not role play, this is an actual child. Now, to be clear, there wasn't an actual child. This was role play on the behalf of the officers, role playing that they were role playing. She eventually was released for time served, and the charges of attempted solicitation of a minor, abuse of a child, and everything else were all dropped. But most cases with stings like that, people do go to jail. And usually role play as a defense is not an adequate defense. So one of the things that I am educating folks in the kink community about this now is when you're interacting with somebody online, first you have to recognize the possibility that this is not just somebody pretending to be somebody they're not, but may actually be a law enforcement officer. If a guy drives down the street to pick up a sex worker, most of those guys have some understanding that they run the risk of picking up a law enforcement officer pretending to be a sex worker. But I think most people on Grindr or FetLife or hookup sites, swing sites, etc., I don't think they realize the possibility that they could be interacting with an officer that is engaging in potentially entrapment kind of behavior. I think they need to. I encourage folks that if they interact with somebody, don't meet up with them without verifying the identity. If you're engaging in edgy kind of role play, including age play, at some point you always need to state, I am not interested in engaging in illegal behavior. I am only interested in engaging in role play. And officers that engage in these stings tell me that once somebody says something like that, they're going to walk away. They're going to end the sting because they're allegedly not interested in arresting innocent people. And I think most of them are not. But they view many of these folks in sexual subcultures as dangerous perverts. And there is a perception that if you're interested in age play, that you probably are also interested in actually abusing real children. Now, that's not true. There's no evidence to support that. But that was a case where, A, it opened my eyes to how much this is going on. B, it exposed me to the risk that innocent people run of getting looped into these situations. And I now see some of this activity. I've seen in some Reddit naturist and nudist groups that it is fairly common for people to come into these groups and post comments about, well, I'm a teenager, I'm 12 or 13 years old, and I want to be a nudist. How can I convince my family to go along with this? Most of those are stings. Most of those are law enforcement officers pretending because they're soliciting or eliciting predators to come at them, and then they turn around and prosecute them. And that's probably a good thing. But the people that are innocent, naturist or nudist, they need to be aware of the risk of who they're interacting with. Again, there is such a righteous indignation, persecution of people that are sexually diverse right now, that we need more people out there aware, and we need more people out there stepping into cases like that to educate juries and judges about, for instance, age play, and that there's no connection between age play and sexual abuse of children.
And I'm wondering too, like, are these officers receiving training on kink before they go into these spaces? What kind of education are they getting?
Absolutely none, as far as I can tell. They get trained on how to engage in these sting behaviors, but they don't get trained on these sexual subcommunities. And I have heard officers make really gross generalizations about kink, for instance, and kink related to sexual abuse. They don't understand that consensual kink is radically different from sexual abuse and non-consensual behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, age play is not illegal. Between two consenting adults, it's a completely legal kink activity. And that concerns me if the officers aren't receiving the proper training.
Yeah, and unfortunately, prosecutors are elected, district attorneys are elected, and I've seen prosecutors go after some of these cases because it is a way for them to stand up and, when running for election. And, I defended against these perverts and I locked up these sexual predators. Some of them are people engaging in criminal sexual behavior. Some of them are not. In the United Kingdom, there was a famous case where gay leathermen were engaging in consensual kink behaviors that were pretty extreme, and punching, scarification, whipping, things like that. And they were making videos of it. And these videos got released into the underground, and police found them and then started looking for these individuals because they viewed this behavior as criminal. Eventually, they found some of these guys and prosecuted them. And it went all the way to the European Supreme Court. This is when the United Kingdom was still part of the European Union. And the European Supreme Court ruled that you could not consent to that level of physical harm. That even though it was kinky and consensual, that this was still criminal. Now, I argue that if I can consent to step into an MMA ring and potentially face life-altering brain injury, why can I consent to that, but I can't consent to being whipped until my back or bottom bleed? And unfortunately, there are a number of cases around the world of juries and judges and legal systems making decisions like that sex is different. In my mind and the way I approach it, sex is a behavior. It has unique aspects, but it is not intrinsically different from any other human behavior. When I talk about it that way, I want to help people make objective decisions.
Are you curious about sexology? Do you want to further integrate sexology into your work or your life? Well, friends, then we've got something just for you. It's called the Sexology Practice Guide, and it walks you through the ways this shows up in your work, in your life, and guides you through working within your scope, incorporating intimacy and sexual health into your work without starting over. Download this short, practical guide at sexologylab.com/guide. That's sexologylab.com/guide. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe and share. And now, back to the show.
So I'm curious, because you've been doing this work for a while, how has this changed for you in the last 10 years or so? Like with technology, I mean, there's so many different things that could have an impact on this work.
Well, it has certainly picked up a lot. When I started doing this, I'd be involved in 1 or 2 cases at a time. And now I'm retained in, I want to say, at least 10 or 15 cases right now. There's so many more of these. The impact of them, I think, has changed pretty significantly. Although I can't talk about the details of it, I'm involved in a case that is in Texas about Texas passed a law requiring age verification on pornography. And that case went before the Supreme Court last January. And to have a case that I was involved in before the Supreme Court, to have my reports and information as part of the case for the Supreme Court is huge, is not anything I ever anticipated. And so that, I think, is the biggest thing, that I am seeing the impact of these cases rising at a exponential level that impact people's sexual freedom, people's freedom of speech, and that's huge. And I'm honored to have the ability to assist in these cases, but I never anticipated them being at this level. I'm also involved in a couple of really significant celebrity cases involving some of these issues, and just wild experiences sitting down with these worldwide renowned celebrities and talking to them about sex and their sexuality is not anything I ever anticipated 20 years ago when I was looking at these porn pictures that this kid printed out on his neighbor's printer. I had no idea where all that was going.
Yeah, it's interesting the journey that life takes us on sometimes. So, what are some of the most interesting cases that you've either been a part of or that you've heard of happening, even if you weren't a part of it?
One of the most challenging cases for me was a case called the Mr. Double case. This was a case in West Texas where a guy for about 14 years ran an online website where he shared stories that people had written about sexuality and erotica. It was a subscription site, and he allowed people to publish stories about child sexual abuse, around pedophilia, etc. And most sites, most of the more public and like Literotica won't allow stories with child sexual abuse. Some other sites have. He allowed those stories. And so over time, those stories kind of took over the majority of his site, and most of his viewers or users were there for that material. The FBI prosecuted him, and it was a wild case because every story that was published on the site had a statement that this is a work of fiction, no children were actually abused or harmed. There were also a couple of drawings on the site, a couple of computer-generated anime, manga images, and he was prosecuted for obscenity. And I was brought in to testify for the defense, testify that obscenity is a certain legal kind of term of art established by various Supreme Court precedents. And something is not judged obscene if it has any literary, scientific, or artistic merit. I was going to testify in this case that while these stories were gross and while these stories were frightening and not anything that most of us would find arousing or want to read, that they do offer some scientific and clinical insight into the minds of people that do sexualize children. There's some evidence that access to material like this may reduce risk to offend against real children. As disgusting as some of this stuff was, that it is consistent with well-known literature. And so, for instance, the Marquis de Sade, when he was incarcerated in a prison in France, he wrote a famous story called 130 Days of Sodom, I think. And it's a fascinating story. He wrote this on like this almost like toilet paper parchment, and he hid it in the walls of this prison. The Marquis de Sade, sadism is named after him. He was a highly sexual libertine in the 1800s of France and engaged in sadistic behaviors and wrote about engaging in sadistic behaviors. And this story that he wrote, 137 Days of Sodom, involved gross violence and sexualized murder and all kinds of sadistic sexual behavior. The wild thing is that parchment that he hid in the wall of the prison was found, I want to say 75 years later. It was sold at auction in France, I think about 5 or 6 years ago. It was bought by the government of France, and it is now displayed in French museum as a French treasure, as a French cultural treasure. I was going to testify that this material is consistent with this other art that is identified as a French cultural treasure. How can we say that this doesn't hold some literary merit? I was excluded at trial, and you have to understand that in expert witness testimony, there are certain standards that you have to meet called Daubert or Frye, where your testimony has to be reliable, has to be based on some standard general industry acceptance. It can't just be your pet theory. There has to be some reliability, some error rate, etc. So you can't just make this stuff up. You can't just testifying based on your personal opinions. You have to have evidence and scientific research to really support it. So the judge in that case excluded me. and said that my testimony wasn't reliable, which I was, at the time, I was like devastated. I thought, wow, I'm never going to testify in court again. What was wild was that the guy was convicted, sentenced to prison, and for a crime that had no victims, for a crime where it was a thought crime, he was distributing stories and thoughts that we don't want people to think about. That in and of itself is troubling. In that trial, the defense was not allowed to talk about the First Amendment and that this guy had some First Amendment protections. And that guy is still in prison, and he was an older guy, and I think he will potentially die in prison for the crime of publishing and distributing these stories of sexuality that we don't want people to think about. But in the appeal, it went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the most conservative court of appeals in the United States. I mean, they are very, very right wing, but they ruled that the judge had been in error to exclude me. And they overturned that exclusion, said I should have been allowed to testify. And that was huge to have the most conservative court rule that me, in their, quote, defending perverts, should have been allowed to testify. And that was a very formative experience for me, both in terms of seeing how courts are dealing with these sexuality issues, but also seeing my role and how I have to defend my objectivity so carefully.
Yeah. And I'm curious too, from a little behind the scenes, is there a record of all of the cases you've been an expert witness for, ones you've been excluded from, like that other attorneys and judges can see?
Yes, kind of. I mean, attorneys can search what's called LexisNexis, which is a database of legal decisions and cases. They can search for my name and find out cases where I've been involved. I maintain a list of all the cases I've been involved with, particularly cases where I have provided sworn testimony or been deposed. There are different courts, and federal rules and state rules are different. Federal rules, I have to provide a list of all cases I've testified in the past 10 years, I think. My kind of list goes back many years, more than that, and I just keep kind of a running list. A lot of the cases that I get involved with, there are criminal cases. That was a criminal case, and there are civil cases where people are pursuing damages. And a lot of the civil cases that I get involved with end up settling prior to trial. So there was a case I was involved in the East Coast where a male teacher engaged in really grossly sexually inappropriate behaviors with male students, flashing them, showing them pornography, talking about sexuality inappropriately with them. These were adolescent males. The teacher was eventually prosecuted and convicted for some counts of sexual abuse against some of his students. Well, other students who had not been molested by him, they later then filed a civil suit alleging that as a result of that inappropriate sexual behavior, which was grossly inappropriate, no argument, but as a result of that sexually inappropriate behavior, that these young men were now suffering symptoms of disturbed sexuality. And so the men, these guys were all in their 20s now, were identifying that some of them engaged in casual sex, some of them engaged in bisexual behavior, some of them watched pornography, some of them masturbated.
Oh no, not masturbated.
And
Not that.
yeah, you read between the lines there. And they were arguing that if those behaviors hadn't occurred to them in adolescence, they wouldn't be doing any of this. And so I worked for the defense in terms of saying, a overwhelming majority of young men in their 20s are engaging in all of these behaviors. That casual hookup sex is more common in people in their 20s than it's ever been in known history. That young men in their 20s are the population that is watching pornography the most. It was also pushing back against plaintiff experts that were making these causal attributions and saying, well, these guys would have engaged in these behaviors if that hadn't happened, and challenging the ability to say something like that. And as a result of my involvement and others, not just me, those cases ended up settling prior to trial for some damages that the school district paid rather than paying the long, extensive cost of trial with potential, damages out of trial. A lot of times that is my role. I don't even end up going to trial, but help the defense. And I'm usually on defense. I've been some plaintiff in some prosecution case, but helping the attorneys ground these issues in some objective reality world, particularly when it comes to sexuality.
And at this point, what's like a rough estimate of how many cases you've been a part of?
Probably between 50 and 100. If you consider only the cases where I have been deposed, which is where you are being interviewed by attorneys, but you are testifying under oath that you swear to tell the truth, or where I've testified in trial, that's about 40 or 50 cases. But then on top of that is easily that many or more cases that never went to trial. I learn something new in every case. I get to learn how to translate information around sexuality and unique issues in a way that the attorneys understand. I've got a case in the South right now where a couple had been engaging in hot wife cuckold sex relationship for about 4 years, allegedly all with the wife's enthusiastic permission and support. I mean, she was picking out the guys that she was having sex with, but then they divorce, and now she argues that that behavior was non-consensual and that she had been coerced into it. And there's a whole lot of money at stake in this divorce. And so right now I'm helping the attorneys that are representing the husband, helping the attorneys understand this lifestyle and think about how to frame it to the jury so that, again, this couple isn't just viewed as abnormal, aberrant, disturbed sluts, but to recognize the range of consensual non-monogamy, the frequency of consensual non-monogamy, because they know, it was talking with the juries, with the attorneys, and they know for a fact that some people on the jury will have engaged in consensual and non-monogamous behaviors or fantasized about it, but they're not going to admit that to the other jurors. So how do we help those jurors to push back against other jurors kind of pathologizing based on ignorance? So yeah, I mean, just fascinating cases. Everyone is different. Everyone is unique. And there's been such an explosion in research and dialogue around sexuality and aspects of sexuality that we never talked about before, that I have a wealth of information that I get to bring in and translate to the attorneys and to the juries so that, again, they make decisions based upon the best understanding. And I was trained, this is the way I do it. It's not necessarily the way other experts have to do it, but I was trained that my job is not to invest in an outcome, but to help the fact finders make the best decision possible based upon the best information possible. The jury and the judge and the attorneys, they see information I don't, and so they're making the decision based upon that information and my information. So I try not to invest in, I'm arguing for this person to be found guilty, and if they get found innocent, then I lose. That's not my job.
Yeah, and it gives a more objective perspective too, I think.
Yeah, that is one of the ways that I approach it. Yeah.
Curious what advice you would have if we have sexual health professionals listening who want to do this type of work. What advice you have for them?
I don't think you need to have a PhD. I think PhD can help. Juries like calling, hearing somebody called doctor, but it's not a have to. Establish credibility and integrity. Reach out to local attorneys, reach out to local public defenders, and identify that you have an expertise in sexuality and that you're interested in supporting cases around sexuality-related issues. I do some public defender work at decreased rates because I believe in it, but I also will refer cases to local clinicians. There was a case in Oregon that I got asked to testify in where a kinky gay guy was engaging in consensual non-consent with a partner, and the attorney knew that this guy was going to get convicted, but wanted somebody to explain that consensual non-consent actually is a thing and normalize it to try to decrease some of the punishment. And I helped them find a local sex therapist that could explain what consensual consent is and isn't. Those cases, I think, can help you ease in to what it's like to explain this stuff to jurors who never hear about or think about or talk about. They don't get the education. They don't learn to talk about these issues without shame and fear the way that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, David, I want to close things out with a lightning round.
Oh boy, I love these. Okay,
All right.
let's see what we got.
What is one fiction book and one nonfiction book that has impacted your sexuality the most?
So a fiction book by Tim Powers called The Stress of Her Regard, and it's a fantasy book about Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and what's called The Haunted Summer, when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein and Lord Byron was writing about vampires and stuff like that. And it is just this extremely sexy book set in romantic poetry. And there's all this bisexuality and just really erotic, supernatural kind of stuff. Very, very cool, very powerful.
Oh my gosh, we need to channel that for the SAR.
Yeah, there you go. I would love it. A nonfiction book. Honestly, I mentioned Marty Klein's book, America's War on Sex. That book helped me recognize that even consensual, non-criminal sex could be pathologized and persecuted if it was identified in the wrong setting. And so one of the things I'm encouraging folks now is, if you're a content producer, for instance, doing online content production, you need to look around at your neighbors, because your neighbors will be the jurors of your peers if you are prosecuted for obscenity, for distribution of obscenity, because obscenity is a local determination. And so I've seen performers that were performing and producing in Alabama, for instance, and they got convicted for stuff that they wouldn't have gotten convicted of if they'd been living in San Francisco. So amidst today's world, I think we have to take those local considerations into stock around our sexuality. I wish that sexual diversity was safe everywhere, but it's not.
Right. All right, my next question's a fun one. What is a sexy place you want to travel to?
Love to go back to hedonism again. We had an advanced SAR there a few years ago, and it was an erotic environment, I will say. Sex on the beach, so long as you have a way to be out of the sand, is pretty sexy.
I love it.
And it's not just a drink.
Yes. All right, what's the last thing you learned that fascinated you?
I love these historical things that pop up on social media. Like I saw one yesterday of during World War II, a German soldier rigged up a little bomb on a piece of chocolate and left it. And an American soldier found the chocolate, disarmed the bomb, ate the chocolate, and left a note saying, "Thank you, it was delicious." And then the two soldiers engaged in this behavior back and forth for several weeks, neither of them ending up getting injured. And then, darned if they didn't meet each other, they arranged to meet 40 years later and became friends. I thought that was cool.
All right, David, what's your favorite way to relax after a long day?
Sitting in the hot tub, drinking bourbon.
Yeah, perfect. What's something you think everyone should try at least once?
Step outside your comfort zone. On their deathbed, nobody says, "Gosh, I'm really glad I played it safe." When we step outside our comfort zone and we push ourselves is where we grow, we learn, and we expand.
All right, my last lightning round question. One myth about sexual behavior that you would love to retire.
The idea that masturbation reduces testosterone in males. And there was the idea that, football coaches say, don't masturbate or have sex before the game because you'll deplete your testosterone and you'll hurt your athletic performance. And there was actually finally some really remarkable research where they actually had men watch a video and then engage in athletic performance, grip strength, things like that, versus watching porn and masturbating and then engaging in those behaviors. And in fact, masturbation made their testosterone go up and increased their athletic performance.
Wow, I love it. Myth busting here. All right, now I want to quickly ask you about Shaw's annual sexological conference. So, what is it like presenting with Shaw, and why should professionals attend this in-person event?
The Sexual Health Alliance is like no other group I've ever been part of. They are radically exploring things around sexuality that are important. Elevating principles of sexual health, consent, honesty, safety, mutuality, shared values, non-exploitation, but pushing against things that are socially challenged. And at the Sexual Health Alliance conference, you will hear things that you never thought you would hear. Last year, one of the presenters talking about anal sexual health and the ways in which he medically helps people have better anal sex was just extraordinary and really powerful, and something I never thought I'd hear. You will be educated about things that you didn't know you desperately needed to be educated about. And doing it in person is extraordinary because you also, in these online days, you need friends, you need companions, you need allies. And the Sexual Health Alliance is called the Alliance on purpose because it is about developing allies for sexual health.
I love that. Thank you so much. All right, David, my closing question for real. This is my last one. If you could leave one message for the next generation, so our Gen Zs, our Gen Alphas, about sexual health, what would that message for them be, and why does it matter right now?
Examine your shame. Critically examine your sexual shame. Most of us hold sexual shame, and when we look at it, we realize that we're ashamed of things that we were told that we don't believe anymore. But we haven't, because we haven't looked at it, we haven't decided whether we, as an adult with agency, want to let that shame in or not, whether we want to let that shame hold power over us anymore or not. The more I see people free themselves from sexual shame, the more fulfilling and healthier their sexual lives are.
That is great advice. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. David Ley.
Always, Michelle, happy to talk.
Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen. Links are in the description below.